Summer rain on the window. Watch the time float on. Cool air blows a memento as I fall behind. I'm so sorry for dreaming about the future. Maybe I'll be better when we're old enough. Hey, I'm sorry for dreaming about the future.
Hey Fiberista, I'm back with a little more footage from my beach retreat where my girlfriend and I went down to the beach and we each brought art projects to work on and just spent the week relaxing and getting inspiration from the beach in the wintertime and just working on some art. So I brought my spinning wheel and a bunch of fiber and my blending board, and my focus primarily was on art yarn, but I also took some time out to spin some simple 2-ply yarns. Mostly I worked on this white yarn, and I may or may not dye it. I'm not really sure. I have a weaving that I've been working on that's a white and off-white weaving, and I may apply it to that. I may take the 2-ply yarn that I ended up with, and I ended up with a bunch of 2-ply yarn, and over-dye it, because it's been a while since I've over-dyed some plain 2-ply that I had, and it just presents a different texture than the barber poling that you get from spinning 2-plies from dyed roving. Now don't get me wrong, I love me some variegated 2-ply yarn. I love spinning it, I love dyeing the roving, I love the look of the yarn, I love working with it. It's just something I love. So at this beach trip, I spent time spinning this very basic yarn, primarily at the beginning of the trip and at the end of the trip. And the reason being is that I find it really meditative. When I got to the beach on the first day, it was wonderful just to kind of get into the rhythm of spinning yarn and just sitting there with the 2-ply, with my spinning wheel and spinning a really kind of mindless yarn. Now, spinning this 2-ply is kind of my go-to when I want to feel productive, but I don't want to have a lot of hyper focus that's kind of involved with spinning art yarn. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not that art yarn is terribly difficult to spin, it's just that I have to pay more attention to the fibers that are coming into my drafting triangle and deciding how I'm going to manipulate that fiber into the yarn. Whereas with my 2-ply, I can pretty much just go by feel as it's going between my fingers, and just to make sure it's as consistent as I want it to be. I've also been collecting just the singles. Now, most of the yarn that I spun on this trip was primarily spun with weaving in mind, and mostly that's because I've been doing a lot of weaving. The simple yarns are really important in my work, just as important as the art yarn. So I've also been collecting some hand spun singles, and primarily that's for weaving, and because the hand spun singles are a really simple yarn that looks great in the weaving. It's thinner, so it plays nicer with a lot of the thinner yarns that I tend to warp with when I'm working with weaving. So it presents a much lighter fabric. It's also been good because I've been exploring a little bit of tapestry techniques, even on my 4-shaft loom, just to add that different kind of interest in texture and composition to the fabric. And I'll go more into that in another video. But when it comes to working with singles and 2-ply yarns in weaving as well as in knitting, it's these yarns that are just as important as the art yarns that you're working with. It gives a contrast to those art yarns. So if I have like a deeply textured lock spun yarn, you can see where against a very simple yarn, that art yarn really pops. Now, if I were to use just strictly all art yarn, that's a totally different textural thing, but then it becomes more just about the mass of texture. But if I want to highlight the beautiful one little section of yarn, the best way to do it is to contrast it against a really simple yarn. I've been really attracted to using my hand spun, even if it's just a singles or the 2-plies, to contrast against these art yarns. So here are some of my tips for spinning simple yarn. There's just a handful of things that you need to keep in mind. So if you're working with a 2-ply yarn, you're going to want to spin the single in one direction and then ply it in the opposite direction. I use the Z-twist counterclockwise direction on my art yarns because I'm right-handed, so I find it easier for me to manipulate the fibers going across the top of the yarn. Now, if I were to do it in a clockwise fashion, the fiber would be going underneath the yarn. So if I'm dealing with extreme textures that I need to manipulate somehow, it's easier for me to do that across the top of the yarn. But as that relates to my simpler yarns, I tend to want the final yarn to be in the same direction as the art yarn, especially with knitting, because as you're knitting, sometimes, just the act of working the needles can work against or with the direction of the twist. It's kind of hard to explain, but sometimes I find that as I'm knitting, I might be actually unraveling the yarn. So what I tend to do with the plied yarns, I want the final to be in the Z twist, so I tend to make my singles in an S twist, if that makes sense. So in the clockwise fashion, so the final yarn will be so the final yarn will be a Z twist. As I'm spinning the singles, I'm not always sure if I'm going to ply it or not. A lot of times, if I'm spinning like a super variegated roving, then I tend to want to go ahead and ply it. But if I have a roving that's a little more monochromatic looking, I'll tend to want to make that actually a single, because that kind of yarn is wonderful for tapestry. It's also a wonderful background effect because it has just the slightest variegation, but it has a wonderful effect for a contrast against really textural locks and art yarns. No matter what, I usually spin the singles in an S twist. Once I get that bobbin full of the singles, I might look and think, I'm gonna go ahead and ply this. For the 2-ply, you can do a little thick and thin texture. I try to keep it as consistent as possible, but I don't kill myself if it's not. It's just what adds to the quality of the yarn being hand spun. So I try not to sweat it too bad if the yarn isn't terribly consistent in thickness. Sometimes I'll take a batch of 2-ply, and if they're in similar colorways, I might combine them. If I'm knitting a big sweater or something like that. I know sometimes the variegated 2-plies get a little lost in the colors in the weaving. I tend to want to use some of those 2-plies for knitting. But the single plies, I've been collecting those, especially getting ready to go into the deep dive of studying some tapestry weaving. There you have it. Here's some of the yarns that came out of the trip, as well as some of the collection of single plies. Even just little bits left over from making the 2-plies. I'll get these tiny little scraps of single ply yarn, and those are really wonderful to incorporate into my art weaving, especially for tapestry techniques. All right, Fiberistas, thanks for watching. Stay tuned for more demo videos. If you like this video, please hit the like buttons. Give me a comment on what you've been working on lately. And by all means, if you haven't already, subscribe. Talk to you soon.